I was a serial entrepreneur for a while, and I stopped. And the main reason why I stopped starting companies is because either they die, or they go off and do weird things. Those weird things are what most of you probably think of as corporate behaviors. They go out and they start exploiting their workers. They're shoving hard to pay less. They're acting extremely impersonally. And I just thought it was really weird that, you start off trying to make a great restaurant, and within like 3 weeks, you're talking about paying your best employees less. And you start out trying to make a software company, and then you're talking about collecting user data and filtering it through a vast machine to try to get them to spend more time on your website. And it's strange to me that this same suite of behaviors that we call sort of, a corporate mindset is such a strong attractor behaviorally for corporations. And it's also interesting to me that the law from which corporations arise makes allowances for this in such a clear but also ambiguous manner. It's like in really specific circumstances, a company can overstep itself, and in others, it's sort of given the right to act as it will as long as it's within reasonable bounds. So that was the source of my research into this. Allison was kind enough to give us some definitions from AI safety, and the relevant ones here are artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, and I would add one more to her categories, which is collective intelligence. The collective intelligence is an interesting sort of entity because it's sort of like, if you think of an ant colony, it's a collective intelligence. There are a bunch of ants, and a bunch of ants is not an ant colony, and an ant colony is more than just a bunch of ants. The colony is more intelligent than the individual ants, but you can't separate one from the other. You can't have a colony without having a bunch of ants, but you can have a bunch of ants that aren't a colony. And that makes a colony a collective intelligence. A corporation is a similar sort of collective intelligence, which has a basic unit of persons. And we'll talk about this some more later, but one of the reasons why I believe that a corporation doesn't qualify as a superintelligence is because for some reason humans are really bad at coordinating with each other on certain kinds of problems, such as having a corporation make itself smarter. And if something's not better than persons at making itself smarter, then under Bostrom's definition, it fails to strictly be better than humans at everything, and thus is not a superintelligence. And so considering corporations as artificial intelligences is interesting, and for those of us with a more philosophical bent, we'll just talk about that all day. But I posed this idea to a legal professor of mine. He was like, so what? Who cares, basically. From a legal perspective, this is not actually that interesting of a question because almost everything in law is artificial. And corporations are already covered under the law. They're already restricted. It doesn't help you very much legally to know that corporations are artificial intelligences. It doesn't help you regulate them more effectively. It doesn't tell you what rights or responsibilities they should have. And so why is this a useful or interesting topic, aside from people who are in AI safety, who love to talk about these sorts of things because it helps them figure out when an AI should be regulated, when an AI might be unsafe. But one of the reasons why I worked with Allison and Brewster to bring such a wide variety of people here today is because I believe that you can't regulate artificial intelligences without regulating corporations, without thinking about what it means for a corporation to be separate from the people who make it up. When you're looking at corporate behavior and you're trying to figure out if a corporation is acting as it ought, whether it needs to be regulated, you need to ask yourself, is this corporation acting? Or are its officers acting? Or is a single individual who founded the company really just having their actions magnified? And all of these questions actually are very well informed by asking, is the corporation its own separate intelligence from the people? Elizabeth was kind enough to go through some of the basic definitions of corporations, and they're very interesting if you really, really think about them. Like, why should a sole proprietorship not really give you any legal immunities, right? And the answer for that is because it is just that one person. When that person dies, the company is automatically dissolved. And so why should that person have immunity from liability when it is really just that person? Which brings you into another interesting question, which is why should any corporations have any limited liability? The answer to that is mostly economic. Without some limited liability, people wouldn't all pool their money and sink it into something for which they could be personally sued. The risk-reward just wouldn't work out at all. And so in certain industries like manufacturing, limited liability has been around for much longer than in other industries, for the simple reason that people won't build factories unless they know they're only going to at most lose what they invested in it. And so this tendency to grant legal liability gets to the question of, does this corporation then have a responsibility to society at large to sort of be worth it? You know, should we hand out limited liability to entities that are oppressing like the vast majority of citizens? Probably not. But if they're giving people good jobs and paying citizens, then it's a tougher question. And that's pretty much where the law has come down. In cases where companies are very clearly exploitative through cases like fraud, where they've simply lied to people, the corporation ceases to exist and the people who have been fraudulent can be sued directly. In cases like that, there is no collective intelligence in the eyes of the law. There's no corporation whatsoever. It's just these like few people who have lied to others, and well, it sucks to be you. You shouldn't have broken the social contract. And so questions of corporate personhood, in my mind, are tied pretty closely into questions of whether or not the corporation is a separate entity from the people who make it up. In situations where the people can be looked at directly by the law, then the corporation has proven that it is not an artificial intelligence. Whereas in other situations, such as very large corporations in which any officer might be replaced at any time and the corporation would sort of just keep going, in those situations, often the corporation can come to have a life of its own. Sort of by the point where they reach enough momentum that they're independent of any individuals, they are their own entities. And this is one of the original reasons why corporation was granted back in the Roman era, was because people were founding things that they wanted to outlast them. They were used for guilds, for churches, for other organizations that just wanted to continue past the death of a single individual and had a large body of people comprising it. Many of the things that we think of as corporate have been tacked on later after this useful structure has been used in other ways and the law had to catch up and adapt. So there are various perspectives that we can take on corporations. There's the perspective that because they have limited liability and other special privileges, they're creatures of the state. And they should be regulated just like anything else of the state so that they make sure that they maintain their societal function. And there's a view that they're just a collection of people, in which case you just look through the corporation at the people. And this is one of the major perspectives that leads to findings that corporations should have more rights, is why should these people lose their rights because they're members of a corporation? And then there's a third perspective, which is that corporations are their own separate entities with their own collective intelligence. And one of the major criteria dividing these three perspectives is whether or not the corporation acts in a manner which is qualitatively different than what its constituent persons would do. If it does, it's pretty easy to assert, well, that's something that corporation has done which literally none of the people working for it would do. But it's pretty hard to prove any time when liability concerns like that come up that the person who actually acted is not responsible for their own actions. And so we get into questions of, does the fact that the person is in this highly structured environment play into whether or not they would have done that anyway? And similar questions to that are the crux of my literature review. And if you're interested, I get really long-winded and talk about all kinds of sources in that. It's on the website that Allison mentioned. I'm not going to go into it because it's not boring, but it's not what you're here for either. So I'm going to move on real quick and talk about some of the conclusions from my literature review for artificial intelligence. First, we can assume that as artificial intelligences become more intelligent and more useful, they're going to be treated by the law and by policy in an ad hoc fashion. And what this means is that the law isn't going to look at artificial intelligences and say, first thing, all artificial intelligences are the same, here is how they will all be regulated. They're going to look at, Facebook's sorting algorithm, and they're going to maybe place some limits on sorting algorithms. And they're going to look at self-driving cars, and they're going to say, self-driving cars are this sort of a thing, they get regulated the same way. And if you're saying that Facebook and self-driving cars should be treated the same simply because they're both artificial intelligences, it's just not going to hold weight in the court for the same reason that corporations are treated very differently, because they have different constituents, they have different legal concerns, and thus different legal precedents apply. Another finding is that we can expect emergent cultures to come out of very powerful artificial intelligences, just as they have come out of very powerful collections of individuals. To the extent that a corporation is separate from its individuals, it's because those individuals exist in a corporate environment. And if an artificial intelligence of any sort changes the environment in which the individual humans act, you can also assume that there will be a separate, sort of qualitatively different set of behavior those people exhibit, which would simply not exhibit separately from the situation the AI has put them into. Third, we can guess that AIs will have a multi-dimensional existence. And what that means is that an AI will be different things to different people. If a church is using an artificial intelligence to find new members to bring into its congregation, it's going to be looking at the AI as a spiritual tool to improve the welfare of its community, versus a corporation using an artificial intelligence for economic reasons. These different layers of existence may apply to the exact same algorithms and the exact same processes, but from different perspectives, they have different legal communities fighting for and against them. They have different people speaking out on behalf of them, and they have different associations with different interest groups. This multidimensional aspect of existence needs to be considered for artificial intelligences just like it is currently considered for corporations. Otherwise, everybody's going to be stuck in their own silo, and when an artificial intelligence starts to do weird stuff, it might be acting in just an area that's completely different from anyone's expectations. Third, we need to look at artificial intelligence from a corporate production standpoint. Corporations are very closely involved in the creation of artificial intelligences now, often at the forefront of artificial intelligence development. Regardless of whether you agree with me that corporations are themselves artificial intelligences, it's really hard to look at the field of artificial intelligence and say Google's not involved with it, Facebook's not involved with it. Huge corporations that are pouring millions of dollars into research on these topics aren't involved with it. And so if you're looking at regulating artificial intelligences, you need to be looking at regulating the things that build artificial intelligences, that employ them, that restrain them using internal mechanisms, and that are making the incentive structures under which engineers learn how to build artificial intelligences. These different perspectives are all, I feel, pretty useful. They're all laid out in my paper. I have way better sources in there, and that's I think, going to wrap it up.